Okay. Do you want to be the rep for today? If that's okay with you, we can start right away. Oh, okay. If you're not okay with it, I can pick up anyone. If you're okay as well, just let me know. So let me quickly check if anyone is also willing to step up to help out as well. Let me check. So I realized that some of you have joined with 2 accounts. Please join with only one. That was the first thing. First, join with only 1 account. Don't join with 2 accounts. And in terms of the attendance, as you guys might have realized from last week, I made available the attendance list to you. So if anyone should have any issue as to whether the TA recorded the attendance or not, just go back to the sheet that I posted on Canvas, have a look at it and get back to him. Henceforth, just email your TA and tell him that, hey, I think you might have skipped me here or there. So that will be one important announcement. Don't send me an email, send the email to the TA. Secondly, I think I made mention that in case you would like your attendance to be taken, you should write your full name and write yes attached to it. Most of you did that, but some didn't, and it caused a lot of problems. So you have someone with an account name that is named in a very funny way, and the person didn't write the name for us to make him or her out. And obviously we'll have issues with trying to record that. So just keep an eye on that. Whenever you are about to record your attendance, write your full name and attach the code for the day. Either I tell you guys to write yes, or I tell you guys to write present. Quite apart from that, I think everything has been okay. If you happen to have any issue, just let me know and I can help you guys with it. So let me quickly go back to the chat room again and see if someone is willing to help. Alex, are you willing to be the reference? To be frank, so I don't know who is what. Any of the Alex?
I only Michael.
Okay. Again, Alex. Is there any reply from Alex? Okay, he doesn't have a mic. Again, just to give everyone the chance to be a rep, I'll still go through it and pick it. Sybil Jiang, do you have a mic and are you ready to be the rep? Sybil. Jia Hao He, can you put your mic off? Jia Hao He, can you put your mic off? And Sybil, are you ready to be the rep for today? Sybil Jiang. Okay, it's still okay. No mic still. I'll just go to the ones that's John Luke. John, do you mind being the rep for today? Today as well, if that's okay with you. Okay. So we have issues with the reps for today. So just by way of today's discussion, when John comes in, I'll come back and ask you guys, but just by way of today's discussion, we're going to deal with economic growth, and that will be a new chapter in itself. So today we are going to tackle economic growth, and there are a couple of things that we need to understand here. And as I pointed out from my email or my announcement, you have to read chapter 7 to understand it properly. But just by way of guideline, there are two most important models that we'll be looking at here, the models that we will pay attention to. The first model here is a Malthusian model. And the second one is a solo growth model. These are two contrasting models and they have two different implications. So just keep an eye on it as to which one talks about what. So that's the first part of today's discussion, getting to know the type of models that we have. In terms of the Malthusian model, our point of interest here is going to be based on its prediction. And the prediction is based on the fact that population growth cancels output growth. Or population cancels output. So I'll come back and explain it further. So basically the whole idea here is that standard of living is constant, and standard of living is constant because of the fact that for every increase in growth, there's going to be an equal increase in population that will keep our population, our standard of living to be fixed. So that's the whole idea behind the Malthusian model. And in data, sometimes it might be true, sometimes it might not be true. So we're trying to look at the Malthusian model, see where the strength lies, see where the weaknesses is. Then we'll move on to the solo growth model on Thursday, which is more or less trying to dispute the findings that we had in the Malthusian model. So that'll be the whole idea behind this chapter. Economic growth, Malthusian, then we'll go to solo model. Then the next week, we'll go to the endogenous growth model, which will be a build-up on the solo growth model as well. So for this week and the week after, we are going to go through growth, and that's how the outline is going to be. If you have any questions, let me know. If you don't, then I will just go straight away, deal with the Malthusian model. Luke, have you gotten the mic?
Yes, I have. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry
Yes.
to disturb you.
No worries.
We had issues with the representation. So let's quickly go through today's build-up, see where our point of concentration will be coming from. So as I pointed out, we are going to deal with the economic growth. The first thing here is we have to look at the facts surrounding economic growth. And if you look at the textbook, the very first page or so, we have the facts that are behind economic growth. And I think there are 7 facts that were given, and I'll tackle 4 also, given that we've gone past time. So the first thing is that the standard of living is constant. That's the first economic fact that you realize. The standard of living is constant. And this you have to be very careful. This fact relies on time. If you look at this fact, it is true only if we look at it before the Industrial Revolution, somewhere before 1800, before we had the whole idea of having the combustion engine, the heat, what's the name, revolution and all that. Before that, the standard of living was constant. So for instance, if I happen to have 3 apples in a day in 18 or 1780 or so, I'll constantly have 3 apples regardless. The number of consumption or the amount of consumption that I have still remains the same. It doesn't change. So that's the whole idea behind the standard of living. What you feed on every day remains the same. However, after 1800, we had what we call the Industrial Revolution, where we had these cars coming in, we had the whole idea of heat engine and all that. And when that came in, the standard of living no longer became constant. It became more or less like growing over time. So with this fact, you have to be very careful about it. It might be true to say the standard of living is constant, but which timeline are you looking at it from? If you are looking at it before the Industrial Revolution, you are right. If not, then you are wrong. If you are looking at it before Industrial Revolution, one important thing here is the Malthusian model, which I'll start looking at pretty shortly, is accurate, it's right. If you talk about before Industrial Revolution, then the Malthusian model will explain the reason why we have a constant standard of living. If not, it will be difficult to explain why we have a varying standard of living. So that's the very first economic growth fact, the fact that we have standard of living, which is constant. The second growth fact that you guys see in the textbook, I believe, is that there is systemic sustained growth, the issue of sustained growth. And this is more or less like counter to what we are trying to talk about in one. So again, after the 1800s, where we had the Industrial Revolution, the rate of growth became, it began to increase over time. So when you talk about this economic growth, the Malthusian model will not be able to explain it, given some factors that I'll try to look at. So that's the second important economic factor as well. Why is it that we experience economic growth? And which model can best explain it? Will it be the Malthusian or will it be the Solo? Or in another respect, is it going to be the endogenous model? So these are things that you have to keep an eye on when you're talking about the economic growth. The third important issue here is the issue of investment and output. With this important factor as well, what we see in the textbook and in data is that they happen to be positively correlated. That is to say, whenever there is an increase in investment, there is an increase in output. So with this factor as well, the solo growth model can explain it well. The Malthusian model cannot explain it. So again, have a look at which model best explains it. And for the sake of time, I'll just finish with the fourth growth model. And I believe that happens to be the negative correlation between growth and output. So the negative correlation between population growth and output, or standard of living. So again, output per person. So again, with this fact as well, they happen to be negatively correlated. That is to say, the output per person the amount of apples that you can eat in a day for each individual reduces as the number of people increases. So this is an important factor as well in terms of economic facts. And here, it is in line with what we see in the Malthusian model. So 1 and 2 really supports the Malthusian. Where in the Malthusian model can best explain why we see this, while the others, given what we have on the board, Malthusian cannot explain. And given the fact that Malthusian cannot explain it to us, we have to move away and use a solo growth model. So for the sake of time, I'll just label this 4. If you have any question as to what the growth fact means, just, ask. And if there's no question, then I'll just start right away and start looking at the basis of the Malthusian. Is there anyone with any question in the chat room? John?
Not as of right now, no.
Okay, then let's quickly start by looking at the Malthusian. Having looked at the facts that surrounds it. So if you happen to be around, type present, not yes. Type present with your full name before the present. Full name, present. And again, this time around, if there's any issue with the recording, I might not be able to intervene because your TA will be the one to record it. So make sure you do the right thing. Your full name, you type present, and I'll send it to him. So let's start by building up the Malthusian model, which is the first part of this week's discussion. It's a growth model. We start by looking at the production possibility frontier. We produce by looking at the technology, just like what we saw in the previous models. F, we have N, and I'll leave it as that. This represents the amount of hours or the amount of labor hours that is being given to us to produce. One important thing here is that instead of having capital, here we are going to use L, where L represents the land. We're going to use L, where L represents the land. So before we produce anything, instead of using tractors and human beings, we only base on the amount of land that we have and the amount of human beings that we have as well. So here, this is a very old-fashioned model in production. So that's why it best explains what happened before 1800. So we only produce using land and labor, which is the amount of hours of work. Any question? So keep that one in mind before we go ahead. There is no capital as of now. Whenever capital comes in, I'll let you know. But for this model, there's not going to be capital. Then we also introduce a new factor here, that is the amount of population growth. So this is how much we grow as a population or as individuals in an economy. We grow first and first. Our growth as a people depends on how much we consume. So if our consumption is 0, this function gives us 0, which basically says that we are not going to grow. So if I live in a country where there is no food, and the fact that there is no food implies that C equals 0, it means nobody is going to give birth because everybody is starving. And if nobody is giving birth and everybody is starving to death, the growth rate will just go to 0. So that's what this function tells us. For us to grow, we have to consume. And as we consume, we grow. So that's this function. So for you to draw this function, just like what we saw in the earlier case, it's going to be concave. It's concave in the sense that we have C over N, that is our consumption, and we have our growth somewhere here, the population growth somewhere here. At the point where our consumption is 0, our growth is going to be 0. But if the first person, or if we receive the first consumption bundle, like the first cup of water when you happen to find yourself on a desert, then we have a higher rate of growth. The second cup of water is going to be very important to us, but it's not going to be as important as the first one. So even though we are going to grow, we will grow at a very reduced rate. So we keep on growing, but at a reduced rate. So this is going to be a concave function as a function of C and N. Is there anyone with any question in there?
Not right now.
Okay, so this is how we grow, and this is the graph to explain how we grow as he wants. So moving from there, we now have the output function, we now have the growth function, we know how the graph looks like. Let's go on to the third part of today's discussion, just like what we saw.
So we do have a question.
Sure.
Is the N in the equation the new population or the old population?
It's going to be the old population, where the prime here represents the new population. This is more or less like the current, and this is the future. Or you can say this to be the past, and this is the current. Have I answered your question?
Yes.
Okay, sure. So this is what we have. Now let's go to the third part of today's discussion. Remember what we saw in the income expenditure approach, where we had Y equals C equals I equals G plus NS. This is the income expenditure approach. For this Malthusian model, for us to have a better understanding of it, we assume that there is no opportunity for us to save. Remember, this is a very old model. It's a model that represents what happened before 1800. And in 1800, there is no, how do you call it? A fridge or refrigerator to store our farm produce. So if we produce 10 apples today, we have to consume everything. If not, they will all go bad. So given that fact, we don't have investment. And remember, investment is the same as savings. We also assume, for the sake of simplicity, that there's not going to be government, because a very old model, in the olden days, we didn't have anything like government or whatnot. Now, in terms of export and import, let's assume that there is no airplane or any source of transportation that will make things faster for us to trade with the rest of the world. So there's no export and import. So that one also goes to zero. So at the end of the day, our income and expenditure approach implies what we produce happens to be what we consume, right? What we produce happens to be what we consume. And we know that what we produce is the same as what we have here, which is the same as Z, F, L, N. So consumption equals output. Is there anyone with any question as of now? John?
Not right now.
Okay. So we now have the three relationships. We've been able to capture what our output looks like. And again, the most important thing here is you think of this factor as land and no more capital. We'll come back to capital later. For now, it's just going to be land and the amount of hours of work. This is how much we grow. This is how much we have as a form of consumption equals.
So we do have a question.
Sure.
Is there any efficiency parameter? Is that Z or?
Yeah, that's the same technology that we saw earlier. The only difference with the earlier production functions and this one is just the labor. It's just the land compared to capital. Z happens to be efficiency. Here you can think of efficiency as maybe rainfall. You happen to have maybe three rainfalls in a week, but because of chance, rainfall pattern has changed and you have 5 rainfalls. So that will increase the amount of output for you. So your Z here wouldn't necessarily be technology in terms of you having computers and whatnot. No, you can think of it as a technology, but in the olden days, maybe form of rain, maybe a new way of planting apples or something like that. Yeah, so that might be efficiency as well. Yeah. So we have this equation, we have that equation, we have the third equation. Now we are going to place this guy here. Remember, there's going to be a C here. So I'm going to do something here. I'm going to replace this guy here. G as a function of N. But remember, we now know what C is. Remember, we now know what C is. So we can replace C with this guy. So it's going to be Z, F, L, and N. So we have this function. So what we just did here is to replace C with what we have here. So just make sure you are following what we are doing. If it's not clear, just draw my attention. So if that's okay, then we can have the final part. In order to explain how we grow, we have N bar over N equals G as a function of Z as a function of K, sorry, no more K, remember, L, N, all over N equals. Remember what we saw last week in terms of the production function and constant elasticity and constant returns to scale. When you divide something by N, it's the same as you having it as G as a function of Z, F, L over N, and 1. Because the N cancels the N, you have 1, and you have L over N, which is land per capital. So we call this guy here land per capital. And we call this one just 1. So this becomes a function that we need to draw. Now, if you have any questions, just let me know. Questions? John?
Not at the moment.
Okay. So we have the main equations. We've been able to derive them. Now we can go ahead and draw what we would like to draw as well. So I'm going to clean this guy up. And we have N bar equals G as a function of Z, F, L over N, 1, with a function of multiplied by N when I move the N to this side. So this is what I have. So I need to explain how we go as humans. So this is the next graph that you see on page 172, I believe, if you happen to be using chart. So we have this guy. N bar is here, just like what Alex asked. N bar is going to be here. Here, you can take your N here as the X variable. So your X here is going to be your N. Remember this function, we realize that it happens to be concave. So we have that concave function somewhere here, which is Z as a function of whatever happens to be inside. We have current population to future population or past population to current population. It depends on how you look at it. Now we have to introduce in the idea of steady state. This guy here is going to be my 45-degree line. And in math, whenever you hear the 45-degree line, it's more or less like a mirror image. It reflects what you have here. So if this guy happens to be on the 45-degree line, and this guy is 1, then this guy will also be 1. If this guy is 2, then this guy will also be 2. Because of that, the most important line that we need to work with here is this guy here. at that point, your current population is the same as your future population. And that's what we call the steady state. So this is the steady state, where your current population is the same as your future population. So if today your population rate, the total number of people you have happens to be 10, tomorrow the total number of people you'll be having will also be 10. Yeah, John?
Yes. So someone asks, why did we draw the 45-degree line?
Yes, to explain what a steady state means, right? So we drew the 45-degree line to show, remember this equation tells us a relationship between tomorrow's population as to today's population. That's basically the relationship that we have here. So that's what we drew earlier, and we had this. Now, the new idea that I need to bring in is the idea of steady state. And I think I should have motivated that earlier. The idea of steady state means that it will be a point where your x is just the same as your y, or put in another way, the value of your y doesn't change. The relationship between the two variables just remains the same. And that's what we have here. At this point in time, what you have in terms of today is what you have in terms of tomorrow. So that's what we call steady state. Steady state means that a state of rest where nothing changes anymore. Is that okay? If it's not clear, let me know. John?
I think so. They might be considering writing another question, but...
Sure, then we can wait for him. So feel free to ask your questions. We can have a look at it. If there is no time, we can look at it maybe some other time. Yeah. So we have the steady state given to us, where the point where the population rate happens to be the same. Now, the most important question I'd like to ask here is, at the point of the steady state, what will n bar over n be? Anyone? What is n bar over n? What is it? Yeah, 1. Correct, because they are just the same. So keep that in mind. At steady state, this guy here is going to be 1. If you have questions, let me know. Good. So we are done drawing everything here. We can now go ahead and see into detail the whole idea behind this Malthusian. So now what I'm trying to do is to motivate the math behind Malthusian and see what happens in steady state. So if you go back to the notes, you tend to see that the output was given to you where L equals L star and all that. So let me come back and motivate the Malthusian, right? The Malthusian says that steady state output per capita or standard of living will be fixed because of population. So that's his argument. He says that the output per capita or standard of living of people will forever remain fixed, which is y over n. This guy will forever remain fixed because of n. This guy will forever remain fixed because of n. This guy is fixed because of n. Let's see his argument. This is his basic argument. He says that Remember y happens to be,
We have a question.
sure.
Sorry to interrupt. Someone asks, is it because of growth of n, or maybe the second one was supposed to be n apostrophe, but they're asking, is it because of the growth in n?
Because of population. And I'm going to explain it very just about now. You see it clearly. You might want to call it because of the growth in n bar, because it will take time for the n bar to increase to the point where you go back to your steady state. But for now, let me just motivate it with something more simplistic. Then we look at it more into detail. It's going to be n bar for sure, but it will depend on the short run n bar and the long run value as well. Is that okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Sure. So remember y happens to be F labor n all over your n. The question here is, if your z, which happens to be the rainfall, at the point of z1, you happen to have 10 apples. At the point of z1, you happen to have 10 apples. And now z1 has increased to z2. Because z1 has increased to z2, instead of 10 apples, you now have maybe 20 apples, which implies the number of apples for everyone in the population has increased. So I used to have only 10 apples per person. We now have 20 apples per person. Standard of living has increased. So that's the very first part of the argument. But his argument is that if you live in a community where standard of living has increased, just like what we just saw here, then people will start to give birth. If because of poverty, I wasn't able to feed a lot of people, so I just stuck to 2 kids. Now that I have 20 apples, I can afford to have more kids. You can also afford to have more kids. The next person can also afford to have more kids. And as we keep on having more kids, the number of people that we have in the population will also keep on increasing. So n increases. And because n has increased, y per person will now come down, which implies at the end of the day, this guy just becomes fixed. He doesn't change. Standard of living is fixed. So that's his argument. That's where this population comes in. Questions, John? If you understand it, then we can go ahead and have a look at it into detail. Yeah.
Yes, we have a question. Is this before the 1800s? And if so, what is Z representing then?
I think I made mention of the fact that the Z represents rainfall instead of we thinking of it as in the form of computers and whatnot, right? So you can think of it as a rainfall, or you can think of it as a way of planting seeds. So we used to have planting seed just by throwing it. Now we have a more efficient way of throwing it and all that. Is that okay? John, did I answer the earlier, as in Y, Z, the difference between the Z?
I think you made mention of it a little bit.
Yeah. So Z here represents like maybe rainfall, instead of thinking of it as efficiency or computer in terms of periods after 1800s. Is it okay with everyone? If you have questions, let me know. Is there any question in there, John?
No, sir.
Good. So let me try and then, now that we understand this mechanism, let's go back and think about the steady state again. The steady state that we just finished drawing. So remember, we had how the population would move. We have J here, we have N bar here, we have N here. And we have the 45-degree line, which means the point where we forever be in the steady state. The point where N will be the same as N bar. This is n star. This is n star. This is steady state value. At this point in time, n1 is less than n bar. Whilst at this point in time, somewhere here, n2 is greater than n bar. Now, what you need to understand here is how are we going to move from n1 to n star, because that is always going to be our state of rest. No matter what happens, we will have to come back to n star. If we happen to be below it, we for sure have to come back to it. If we happen to be above it, we for sure have to come back to it. If you happen to find yourself here, the point where your n1 is lesser than your n star, then the whole idea is if you have an output which is y1, which is y, big Y over n1, because this guy is small, which means he's less, your output is higher than usual. Because your output is higher than usual, your standard of living is high. And remember, as your standard of living increases, you'll be tempted to give birth to more people. And the more people you give birth to, your N will now start growing. It will start growing up to the point where it will come and reach this guy. And that's the whole argument. So when we are below the N star, standard of living is high compared to steady state value. And people will start giving birth to more people. And as we give birth to more people, N will start increasing back to where we are supposed to be. The same thing applies to this side. At the point where we have N2, initially what we have is our population rate is higher than usual. So this guy is extremely high, which means...
Excuse me, sir.
Sure, feel free.
We have a question. How can we understand the gap between the concave line and the 45-degree line?
The 45-degree line is just a point to show you where your y variable is the same as your x variable. That's the mirror image. There's nothing technical about it. Is that okay, Alex?
I understand that, but the gap between the two, I think, is wondering about that. What does that represent?
I don't want to call it a profit function. No. I don't want to call it the rate of sensitivity. No. Maybe you might want to call it the growth rate, at the difference between the growth rate where we need to be compared to the steady state. So if this happens to be the growth rate at, in steady state where this guy happens to be 0, because we are below steady state, the gap needs to be positive. And then the higher rate will obviously outdo to the point where we are at 0. Take it as this. At this point in time, our rate is lower than where we are supposed to be. So we are negative. So it will pull us back to the point where we have no change. So this is a positive where this guy, the rate of growth is technically higher than where we are supposed to be. Whilst at this point, the rate of growth is technically lower than where we are supposed to be. So we need to for sure go to the point where it is 0, looking at this function. And we need to, catch it up. Do you see the difference? Is that okay?
Can I think of the concave line as n bar or n prime, and the 45-degree line as n, and then the transition will be the same as you mentioned on the x-axis?
Yeah, you can also think of the g as a slope in a way, if you are giving a function. But the difficulty here is we are not giving a function of the g. If this is your x and this is your n prime, then this obviously becomes a slope. Is that okay? The g function becomes a slope, but we don't have a function to look at it more into detail.
Okay.
Yeah. So just look at it as a gap from where we need to be to where we are supposed to be. So back to where we are at here, because our rate is higher than the steady state, obviously, just like what Alex asked, we have a negative gap. And because of this negative gap, there's a need for us to come back to normal. So first thing first, our population rate is extremely higher than where we were supposed to be. So everybody in the population is now having less apples per person. And because we have less apples per person, nobody would like to give birth, or people are starving to death. And as people starve to death, the population rate reduces. So that's why we have to move from here back to this side. So as we starve to death, the population rate now starts reducing, and this guy starts moving back to normal. So we come back to the steady state where we are supposed to be. Is that okay with anyone? Is there any question in there?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. So that's what we need to understand in terms of the growth rate and in terms of the population. So if you understand this graph for the Malthusian, how the growth rate comes back to steady state, then the rest of the graphs becomes easier for us to comprehend. So let's quickly go back to the rest of today's discussion where we have output per person and all that. So we have to look at the increase in Z. Before we go ahead, let's draw the two. So we have this guy, we have output per person. Let me draw that graph first. So remember, we have the output per person, which is y equals Z as a function of L as a function of N. We divide them by N. We divide them by N. We now have, when you divide by N, if you guys check the book, if you divide anything by N, it becomes the output per person. So this guy becomes Z, this becomes F as a function of L over N as a function of 1. Because this guy happens to be over N as well, and this guy is just 1, we have Y equals Z, F, L. So this is the output per person. If you have questions, just let me know. So this is the output we have per person. And remember the property that we saw, that our output is the same as our consumption. What we produce is what we eat. So C equals this equals that. Is there any question with this?
Not right now, no.
If there are no questions, then I need to draw this graph. So for this graph as well, we put, I believe we have, is it L? Yeah, we have L, and then we have Y.
We do have a question.
Sure.
What is the small L in that last equation?
Yeah, that's, remember I said, whenever you divide everything by big N, it becomes a small value. So land, imagine we have 10 acres of land, and we have 10 people in the economy. How much will each person possess? If it is 10 acres and we have 10 people, it's just going to be 1 per person, right? Yeah, so that's basically it. So the small L represents how much each person possesses in terms of the overall total. Right?
And somebody asks, so little L is land per capita?
Yeah, land per capita or land per person, correct. Yeah. Questions, feel free.
No more as of right now.
Sure. So in terms of the relationship between this guy and this guy, as the land per person increases, the output per person also increases. So that's a graph that we tend to see here as well. So we have a graph that captures land per person to output per person, and we also have a graph that also captures the overall movement in terms of your growth. So if all the graphs are okay, if all the notations are okay, then I'll go to the main conclusion for this chapter, the main conclusion under the Malthusian. If everyone is okay with it. If not, let me know. So let's go to the main conclusion for the Malthusian. We now know how to draw the graphs. I'm now going to combine both graphs and see how best we can make sense of the Malthusian. So remember what the Malthusian said. The Malthusian says that whenever there is increase in output per person, it will for sure go back to the steady state because population will increase to meet this particular change in output. So I'm going to draw the graph, which you might find on page 175. So we have the first graph here, which captures the relationship between the labor and consumption per person, C. And we have the other graph here, which captures consumption per person and then the population, just like what we saw. So I'm going to draw the two to capture the relationship between the two. And this is going to be G as a function of small c. Remember why we have small c over there. And because this is population, right? Remember in the steady state, we have this guy to be 1. And because of steady state, we have a steady state consumption. So this is the consumption level that we expect everyone in the economy to have at the end of the day. Standard 10 apples per person, regardless. So in steady state, this is what we expect everyone to have, 10 apples per person. This is the production function where we saw earlier, Z to be a function of F and L. Now the question here is, if Z is to increase, Z has increased to Z2. This guy is not going to change in the long run. He's not going to change in the steady state because remember what we said. We said that in the steady state, consumption remains the same. What we need to pay attention to here happens to be this guy here. This is the consumption. This is the steady state consumption that we saw over here. We said he's not going to change. So we start looking at what happens in between the period and what is the transition between them. So this is the amount of land per person that we saw earlier. This is the steady state consumption, which is the same as this guy. When output per person increases, because this guy doesn't change, it still remains the same. The implication is that we have to be on the same line as C star. So we have to still be here, which implies L will now move to L2. Output per person is not changing. Consumption per person is not changing. And given that, this guy is the only one changing. And what is the implication for L to move to L2? Remember, L represents land over this. And L2 has reduced. If this guy is down and this guy is fixed, the same amount of land for everyone, what will it imply about the number of people we have in the economy? Anyone to help me? Anyone to help me? What does that imply about the number of people in the economy? L2 is exactly. The number of people in the economy has increased. So that's the whole implication. So there's a whole idea behind the Malthusian. Malthusian says that when there is a technology growth, standard of living does not change in the steady state, The only thing that changes is the number of people that you have. They will increase and they will offset this increase in standard of living. Is there anyone with any question? Is there anyone with any question?
Not right now, no.
Okay, good. Now, if that's not the case, if there's no question, let me quickly draw a graph that explains this diagram. And that's what you see on the next page. So initially we have, this is the period, the time period. This is another time period, T. This is the consumption per person, C star. And this is the period where the Z increased. This is the point where Z increased. In the short run, what happens? What happens is that given that Z has increased, consumption per person will initially increase. But as time goes on, you keep on giving birth to more people, and consumption per person starts reducing and gets back to where it needs to be. So that's a short-run transition. So just like what Alex, I believe, asked earlier, between N prime and N, in between it, N prime keeps on increasing. But at the end of the day, it goes back to normal. And that's what we have here. For the sake of those who we are giving birth to, initially we happen to be here, the same point where we have T. Then at the point where Z increase, we have our population to start increasing, and it goes back to a much higher rate. And that's what we have over there. So that will be the whole idea behind the Malthusian. If you have questions, if it's not clear, send me an email. I can have a look at it again during next week's tutorial. Oh, sorry, Thursday's tutorial. I think it's just about time, right? So yeah, we have 2 minutes more. If you have questions, ask. Luke, is there anyone with any question in there?
Not right now, no.
Yeah, so feel free to send emails if you think it's not clear. Have a look at the video, have a look at what the Malthusian means. Send me an email if you don't understand, and we can have office hours tomorrow. So my office hours is going to be tomorrow. Let's make it 1 to 3 if you have time. You can come in and let's discuss. Okay, see you guys.